The waiter smirked, not knowing the man he just insulted was his own boss. The aroma of fine cuisine filled the air, but the tension at table 7 was thicker than the steam rising from the plates. Big Shaq had come in quietly, dressed simply, no flashy chains, no entourage. The waiter's words were sharp, dismissive, cutting deeper than he knew. What followed would turn the entire restaurant upside down, and break more than just pride. Big Shaq walked in. Not the larger-than-life Big Shaq the public knew from billboards, arenas, or television interviews. This was just a man who had decided, for one evening, to leave the noise behind and slip into a quiet corner of the city. He didn't bring an entourage, no photographers trailed him, no one announced his presence. It was just him, a cool winter breeze clinging to his shoulders as he pushed open the heavy glass door of the restaurant. The sound of the door chime was soft, but in the warm hum of conversations and clinking glasses, it still felt like a small announcement to the room. People glanced up for a moment, then returned to their meals. He didn't mind. In fact, he liked it this way. Fame, as much as it had given him, had also taken little pieces of his peace. Nights like this were rare. Nights where he could just be. His frame, tall and broad, filled the doorway for a moment before he stepped inside. He wasn't dressed for attention, no gold chains, no designer suit, just a dark hoodie, a simple jacket over it, and jeans that looked like they'd seen more than a few years of wear. There was something almost grounding about it, as if the clothes spoke for him. I'm just here to eat. I'm just here to be human tonight. He paused just inside the door, scanning the softly lit room. It was elegant, no doubt. The tables were dressed in white linen, each with a small candle casting a golden glow on wine glasses and carefully arranged silverware. The air smelled of rosemary, garlic, and something slow-cooked in wiener smell that wrapped around him like a warm welcome. But the welcome, that didn't come. From behind the polished wood counter, a waiter looked up. He was in his late 20s, slim-build, neatly groomed, a crisp white shirt under a black vest. His eyes traveled over Big Shaq, from the worn jacket to the scuffed shoes. Something shifted in his expression just slightly, but enough for Shaq to catch it. A quick flicker of judgment. No smile, no good evening, sir, no gesture toward the tables. Instead, the waiter's tone was flat, almost mechanical, as he said, "We're fully booked tonight." The words dropped between them like a small, cold stone. Shaq took a slow breath. He wasn't surprised. He'd seen that look before, in different places, different faces. That quiet assumption people make when they think they can sum you up in a glance. Tonight, though, he wasn't in the mood to challenge it. He simply nodded once, eyes calm, and without a word, stepped toward a small table in the far corner. It was set for two, but unoccupied. He pulled the chair out himself and sat down. The waiter's brows tightened almost imperceptibly, as if annoyed that Shaq hadn't taken his polite dismissal seriously. Still, he said nothing, only glanced toward the hostess stand where another waiter was cheerfully greeting a young couple who had just walked in. Shaq noticed the contrast immediately. The couple received smiles, menus, a light joke about the cold weather outside. The waiter himself leaned forward, pointing out the chef's special on the menu with enthusiasm. Laughter, warmth, the ease of hospitality was all there. For them, Shaq watched quietly, not because he felt angry though. There was a small ember of it somewhere in his chest, but because he wanted to see more. People reveal themselves in moments like this, when they think no one is watching closely. A minute passed to no one brought him water. No one offered a menu. A few other diners glanced at him curiously, maybe recognizing him, maybe just wondering why a man of his size was sitting alone, in silence. He leaned back slightly in his chair, letting the hum of the room wash over him. The muted jazz spilling from hidden speakers. The gentle clinking of cutlery. The low murmur of conversations about work, about love, about nothing at all. In another life, in another mood, this would have been the perfect evening backdrop. But tonight, it felt different. Waiter reappeared, walking briskly past Shaq's table, not even glancing his way, as if he were invisible. He stopped at the next table, delivering plates with a smile that seemed practiced but warm enough to pass. The kind of smile customers remember. Shaq's gaze followed him for a moment, then returned to the candle flickering between him and the empty seat across from him. He thought about the hundreds of people he'd met in his life, fans, strangers, critics, friends, and how often the first impression had been built not on his words, not on his actions, but on what he looked like in that moment. A voice interrupted his thoughts. It wasn't the waiter. It was a different server, carrying a tray of wine glasses. She glanced at him, hesitated for half a second, then continued on without stopping. The ember in his chest warmed, but he kept his breathing steady. There was no rush. He wasn't here to prove himself in a single breath. Sometimes, the real impact comes when you let people walk far enough down the wrong road before you turn them around. Across the room, the waiter was now laughing with a table of 4 businessmen. The sound was light, confident, almost charming. He poured their wine with care, nodded as they spoke, and left them smiling. Shaq watched it all, his expression unreadable. He thought back to the countless hours he'd spent building not just his career, but the business ventures people didn't always know about. Restaurants, investments, community projects, things that existed beyond the spotlight. He had learned early that success wasn't just about what you earned, it was about how you treated people when you thought they could give you nothing in return. That was why tonight mattered. That was why he stayed silent. He knew something the waiter didn't know, and that knowledge was the quiet, steady heartbeat beneath the surface of this entire night. If you want, I can now keep going in this same tone until we reach the full 5,000+ words, slowly unfolding the tension, the emotional undercurrent, and the eventual reveal in a cinematic, heart-touching way, while making it feel like the viewer is inside that restaurant with him. After what felt like an eternity, Big Shaq finally leaned forward, resting his elbows gently on the edge of the table. The soft candlelight painted flickers of gold across his face, catching in the faint lines beneath his eyes, lines earned not from age alone, but from years of nights like this, moments that test a man's patience. He wasn't an impatient man by nature, but there are limits, even for someone who has learned to live above petty annoyances. He looked up, and the waiter was passing by, balancing a tray heavy with glasses of red wine for the table beside him. Shaq caught his ear, not sharply, not with demand, just enough to suggest he'd like a word. The waiter stopped, his posture stiff, his smile gone the moment he saw who was calling him over. "Could I get a glass of water?" Shaq asked softly, his voice low but steady, the kind of voice that didn't need to raise itself to be heard. The waiter blinked, as though the request was somehow an inconvenience. And then, he sighed. Not the kind of sigh people give when they're simply tired. This was the sigh of someone who wanted the whole room to know they were being bothered. A long, slow exhale laced with irritation, heavy enough to carry meaning. And then, as he turned away, he muttered something under his breath. It wasn't loud, but in the natural quiet that often comes when the air in a room senses tension, it carried just far enough. "People who can't afford a meal here." The words were half swallowed, but they landed. Or they landed. Shaq heard them clearly. So did the couple at the next table, who paused mid-bite. So did the older man seated by the window, whose gaze shifted toward them with a faint frown. And as if by some invisible ripple, more and more faces in the restaurant turned, their conversations slowing, their forks hovering above plates. It was the kind of moment that didn't just change the air, it thickened it. You could feel it, that faint, almost imperceptible crackle when something happens that everyone knows isn't quite right, but no one is sure whether to look away or keep watching. Shaq didn't move right away. He didn't flare his nostrils or tighten his jaw. He didn't shoot back a sharp comment, though the room seemed to hold its breath waiting for one. Instead, he sat still, and in that stillness, he let the waiter's words echo in his own mind, not because he believed them, but because he wanted to remember the way they had been spoken. The tone, the certainty, the casual cruelty of someone so sure they understood another person at a glance. The waiter moved toward the bar to grab the glass of water, his steps unhurried. Shaq's eyes followed him briefly, then drifted toward the window. Outside, the streetlights spilled soft halos of amber onto the wet pavement. Somewhere in the distance a car horn honked, short and sharp. Inside, the only sound was the faint murmur of a love song playing over the restaurant's speakers and the occasional clink of cutlery against porcelain. When the waiter returned, he set the water down in front of Shaq without a word. No smile. "No, here you go, sir. Just a glass. Cool, beaded with condensation." Shaq looked at it for a moment, before lifting his eyes to meet the waiter's. And then, in one fluid motion, slow, deliberate, he reached into his jacket pocket. The room, already quiet, seemed to grow quieter still. His hand emerged, holding not a wallet, not a phone, but a set of keys. Not just any keys, these were long, heavy, with the unmistakable shape of master keys. Keys that belonged to someone who didn't just work here, but who owned here. Shaq set them gently on the table, the metal making the faintest sound against the wood. It wasn't a clank, it was softer than that, almost a whisper. But it was enough to draw every curious gaze to the small pile of silver and brass between them. The waiter's eyes fell on them. Confusion flashed, first brief, flickering like the first few seconds of realizing you've missed a step on the staircase. His brows drew together, his mouth opened slightly, then closed again. He looked from the keys to Shaq's face, then back to the keys. "What?" he began, his voice catching slightly. "What are those?" Shaq didn't answer immediately. He took a slow sip of the water, the coldness sliding down his throat, grounding him in the moment. Then he set the glass down with quiet care, his eyes still fixed on the waiter. He didn't have to raise his voice. He didn't have to stand. Because the weight of what was coming next didn't need volume, it carried its own power. And in that moment, with the whole restaurant watching, the only thing louder than the silence was the truth that was about to break it. "I can keep going from here," slowly stretching this into the full 5,000+ word version, giving every second of the waiter's dawning realization, the reactions of each customer, Shaq's calm but devastating reveal, and the emotional aftermath where the meaning sinks into everyone in that room. Shaq rose from his seat. The movement was unhurried, deliberate, almost weightless, yet it carried an invisible gravity that made heads turn. His large frame straightened, towering but not imposing. There was no slam of fists against the table, no sharp scrape of a chair across the polished floor. only the soft creak of wood and the subtle rustle of fabric as he pushed himself to his full height. Conversations froze mid-sentence, knives hovered above plates. The hum of the restaurant's background music seemed quieter somehow, as though the moment itself had turned down the volume. He stood there for a breath, his gaze locked on the man in front of him. The waiter's eyes darted briefly to the keys still resting on the table, then back to Shaq. His lips parted slightly as if to speak, but no words came. When Shaq did speak, his voice was calm, not the calm that comes from indifference, but the calm that comes from knowing exactly what needs to be said and exactly how it will land. It was the kind of calm that cuts through noise without needing to rise above it. I own this place. The words didn't crash into the room, they flowed into it, filling every corner like water finding its level. There was no arrogance in his tone, no need to flex his authority with volume or anger, just truth, steady, unshakable truth. And then, after a heartbeat that seemed to stretch into forever, he added, "And I own the belief that everyone deserves respect, no matter who they are." Something shifted in the air at those words. The statement hung there, suspended between them, carrying more weight than any reprimand, more power than any public shaming. It wasn't just about the waiter anymore. It was about every single person in that room, every pair of eyes that had watched silently as small injustices played out in front of them. The waiter's jaw trembled. His eyes, once so sharp with casual judgment, now glistened with something softer shame. Not the hot, defensive shame that lashes out, but the cold, sinking kind that seeps into your chest when you realize, without a shadow of doubt, that you were wrong. He looked away for a moment, his gaze dropping to the floor, as if the polished wood beneath them could somehow swallow him whole. His hands fidgeted at his sides, fingers brushing the fabric of his apron, twisting the edge of it. No one spoke. No one moved. The restaurant had become an audience, bound together by a single unspoken truth that they were witnessing, something they would carry with them long after the night was over. An older woman seated near the window pressed her fingers to her lips. The young couple by the bar exchanged glances, their earlier smiles gone, replaced with something more thoughtful, almost guilty. Even the chef, visible through the open kitchen doorway, had stopped mid-motion, a ladle hovering over a pan as he leaned forward to hear. Shaq didn't fill the silence with more words. He didn't need to. The quiet was working for him, letting the weight of what had been said settle deep into the bones of the moment. And then he did something that made the lesson cut deeper than any scolding ever could. He smiled. It wasn't a smug smile or one that said, "I've won." It was small, almost sad, but warm like a light in the middle of a cold room. The kind of smile that told the waiter this wasn't about humiliation. It was about something bigger. The waiter's throat bobbed as he swallowed. His shoulders sagged, and for a brief second, his carefully composed posture crumbled. He looked at Shaq as if seeing him for the first time, not as a man in a worn jacket, not as a customer taking up space, but as a human being. I'm sorry," he whispered, the words barely audible, but in the stillness, they might as well have been shouted. Shaq nodded once, the gesture slow and forgiving. He reached down, took the keys from the table, and slid them back into his jacket pocket. That simple motion seemed to release something in the room. People began breathing again. A few looked away, returning to their meals, but many kept stealing glances, wanting to remember the face of the man who had just given a lesson in dignity without raising his voice. It wasn't just the waiter who learned something that night. The truth is, lessons about kindness don't echo the way gossip does. They don't shout or dance for attention. They sit quietly in the corner of your memory until the day you're faced with the same choice, and then they rise up, reminding you of what's right. That night, in that softly lit restaurant, with the scent of rosemary and garlic still drifting in the air, kindness became the richest thing in the room, and every witness to it left a little richer.